Inside a small cafe in Denver, on a cold, rain-soaked morning, Mason Cole wanted only black coffee, his divorce papers, and a quiet drive home. But when a wealthy man named Connor Vale loudly called him a failure, everyone in the room laughed along, except for one woman near the window. Chief Executive Evelyn Carter noticed something the others missed, a stillness in his eyes holding no trace of fear. Then Connor made the mistake of grabbing a waitress at exactly the wrong moment, and Mason rose to his feet, silent as a shadow, the soldier inside him quietly waking. Don't look away now, because the man everyone underestimated in this cafe is about to make everyone hold their breath. The rain had been falling over Denver since dawn, soft and steady, the kind that made the streets shine silver under the gray morning light. Mason Cole pushed open the door of the small cafe on the corner, shaking water from the collar of his old canvas jacket. He chose the same corner table he always chose, the one tucked beside a window fogged with condensation, where he could see the door without being seen first. In his hand he carried a thin folder of papers he had read so many times the corners had gone soft, divorce papers waiting for one more signature. He ordered black coffee, nothing else, and thanked the waitress by name before she even asked. His daughter was staying with her aunt that morning, a small detail he mentioned only once, quietly, before turning his attention back to the folder. He looked like a tired man trying to get through an ordinary Tuesday, nothing more. Near the window across the room sat Evelyn Carter, dressed for a different kind of morning entirely, sharp blazer, leather folio, the posture of someone who ran board meetings before most people finished breakfast. She was the chief executive of a technology security firm, and she was waiting on a call that would decide whether a partnership she dreaded would move forward or finally collapse. Her phone sat face up on the table, screen dark, daring her to check it again. She barely noticed the quiet man in the corner until the door opened a second time and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Connor Vale walked in like he owned the building, trailing two broad men in dark suits who stayed exactly 2 steps behind him. He scanned the room the way wealthy men often do, searching for someone smaller to remind of their place. His eyes landed on Mason, and something like recognition flickered across his face. Connor had once brought his sports car into Mason's garage for repairs, complaining the entire time about the weight, the price, the smell of motor oil on his expensive shoes. Now he saw the same man sitting quietly with a coffee and a folder, and the contrast amused him enough to announce it to the room. He called out loud enough for every table to hear that he never expected to see his mechanic anywhere that served coffee instead of grease. A few people chuckled, not because the joke was clever but because laughter is contagious in rooms where someone powerful expects it. Mason did not look up. He turned a page in his folder as if the comment belonged to someone else's conversation entirely. Evelyn watched the exchange with quiet interest, expecting embarrassment to creep across the stranger's face, but it never came. What she noticed instead unsettled her in a way she could not yet name. Most people who are mocked in public either shrink or snap, their shoulders curling inward or their voice rising to match the challenge. Mason did neither. His shoulders stayed loose, his breathing even, his eyes calm in a way that had nothing to do with patience and everything to do with control. It was the same stillness Evelyn had once seen in a retired federal agent who used to consult for her company, a stillness that came only from people who had learned, somewhere far from ordinary life, that anger was a tool to be rationed, not spent. She filed the thought away, told herself it was nothing, and went back to staring at her silent phone. Connor, encouraged by the laughter, decided the morning had only just begun. Connor stepped closer to Mason's table, hands in his pockets, enjoying an audience that hadn't yet told him to stop. He said Mason probably came here every morning because his garage couldn't afford its own coffee machine, then laughed at his own joke before anyone else could. He mentioned the divorce, somehow already aware of it, through whatever gossip travels through a small city among people with money, and called Mason a man who couldn't keep a wife or a business or a roof that didn't leak. The words were cruel and specific, designed less to wound a stranger than to perform cruelty for the room. A young couple near the door looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Mason's hand remained steady around his coffee cup, his attention seemingly fixed on the rain outside the window. Lisa Moore, the waitress who had greeted Mason by name earlier, approached the table with the practiced calm of someone trained to diffuse trouble before it became a scene. She asked Connor gently if he might lower his voice since other guests were trying to enjoy their morning. Connor turned on her instead, mocking her apron, her tone, the idea that someone earning tips had any right to correct a man who tipped more in a week than she made in a month. The bodyguards behind him said nothing, their faces blank, well trained in looking the other way. Across the room, Evelyn's assistant leaned over and murmured that Connor sat on the board of 2 firms her company desperately needed as allies, and that today, of all days, was not the day to make an enemy of him. Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she stayed in her seat. Mason set his pen down beside the folder, his eyes finally rising to meet Connor's for the first time since the man had walked in. There was no fear in that look, no anger either, only a kind of patient assessment, the way a person studies a storm cloud to judge how long before it breaks. Connor mistook the stillness for surrender and grew bolder because of it. He reached over and flicked the edge of Mason's folder, scattering the loose pages of the divorce agreement onto the wet floor near the door. A few papers slid under a nearby table, ink already starting to smear from the water tracked in by earlier customers. Mason knelt without a word and began gathering them, unhurried, as though the insult had simply missed him on its way past. Connor straightened his jacket and turned to his bodyguards with a satisfied grin, certain he had just won something, though no one in the room could quite say what. He told the men nearby that this was exactly the kind of person who blamed everyone else for failures that were entirely his own. A few customers shifted in their seats, torn between discomfort and the very human instinct not to draw attention to themselves. Evelyn watched Mason's hands as he collected the papers, steady, unbothered, almost gentle, with documents that represented the end of his marriage. She thought briefly that she had misjudged him, that perhaps Connor was right, and this was simply a man too worn down to fight back. She would be wrong within the next 2 minutes, and she would remember being wrong for a long time afterward. Lisa returned a moment later carrying a tray meant for another table, trying to navigate around Connor and his men without drawing further attention. The narrow aisle between tables left little room, and as she passed, a few drops of coffee slipped from a cup and landed on the toe of Connor's polished shoe. The room seemed to hold its breath as Connor looked down at the small dark stain, his face shifting from amusement to something colder and more dangerous. He grabbed Lisa's wrist hard enough that the tray tilted in her other hand, ceramic cups rattling against each other. She froze, more startled than hurt, her eyes wide with the particular fear of someone realizing too late that a situation has changed shape. The two bodyguards stepped forward instinctively, sensing their employer's temper rising, but neither of them moved to actually stop him. Mason had finished gathering his papers by then and was rising from the floor when he saw Connor's hand close around Lisa's wrist. Something in his posture changed instantly, though to anyone watching closely it looked less like anger and more like a switch being thrown somewhere deep inside him. He set the folder down on the table with deliberate care, the way a person sets down something they intend to pick back up very soon. He crossed the short distance between the tables without a sound, his steps measured, his eyes locked not on Connor's face but on his hand. Evelyn would later describe it as the strangest thing she had ever witnessed, a man moving through a crowded room, as if the room itself had gone quiet just for him. By the time anyone else registered what was happening, Mason's fingers had already found the precise point on Connor's wrist that made the grip release on its own. Connor gasped, more from shock than pain, his hand opening before his mind could decide whether to fight the motion. Lisa stumbled back half a step, the tray rescued in the same instant by Mason's other hand, set safely onto the nearest table without a single cup overturned. Connor's bodyguards lunged forward together, the larger one reaching for Mason's shoulder while the second tried to box him against the counter. Mason turned sideways through the gap between a chair and a low partition, using the cramped space the way a swimmer uses current, letting the room's tight geometry do half the work for him. He guided the first bodyguard's momentum into the edge of an empty table, not violently, just enough to fold the man's balance out from under him. The second bodyguard swung wide and found only air, his fist passing through the space Mason had occupied half a second earlier. Evelyn rose halfway out of her seat without realizing it, one hand pressed flat against the table as though the floor itself had tilted. She had spent years around private security teams, retired operators, men who carried themselves with quiet confidence in boardrooms, and she recognized immediately that what she was watching belonged to a different category entirely. There was no wasted motion in anything Mason did, no display, no flourish meant to be seen. Every movement looked almost bored, the way a craftsman performs a task they have repeated countless times before. Within seconds, both bodyguards were neutralized, not broken, not bleeding, simply unable to find their footing or their next move. Connor stood frozen by the counter, cradling his wrist, staring at the quiet mechanic he had spent the last 10 minutes humiliating. The cafe fell into a silence heavier than the one Connor had enjoyed earlier, the kind that follows a sound no one expected to hear. No chairs had been broken, no blood spilled, nothing in the room looked disturbed except the people in it. Mason crouched beside Lisa, checking calmly whether her wrist was hurt, his voice low and steady, completely indifferent to the two men slowly untangling themselves from furniture nearby. Lisa nodded, more shaken than injured, and managed a small, grateful smile despite the trembling in her hands. Mason straightened, picked his folder back up from the table, and reached for his jacket as though the entire incident had simply been a brief interruption to his morning. Connor's shame curdled quickly into fury, and he found his voice again the moment he realized the room was staring at him instead of at Mason. He shouted that Mason had no idea who he had just attacked, that lawyers would be calling before lunch, that a man like him could end a mechanic's entire life with a single phone call. He called Mason dangerous, unstable, a threat to decent people who deserved to be locked away for what he had just done. The bodyguards, still recovering, nodded along weakly, eager to recast their own failure as proof of something sinister rather than simple incompetence. Mason paused near the door, considering whether the comment deserved a response at all. He decided it did, if only briefly. He told Connor, in a voice flat enough to carry no emotion at all, that he should leave before he turned himself into more evidence than he already had. The words landed harder than any punch might have, because they revealed something Connor hadn't considered. This man understood exactly how situations like this ended in courtrooms, who would be believed and who would not. Evelyn, still standing near her table, heard the sentence and felt something shift in her understanding of what she had just witnessed. This wasn't simply a man who knew how to fight. This was a man who knew the law, knew strategy, knew how to control a room even after the violence in it had already ended. Lisa lingered near Evelyn's table once the room began to settle, gathering the courage to speak quietly while Connor argued with his bodyguards near the door. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that Mason came in most mornings, always polite, always quiet, and more than once had paid for a stranger's meal without ever waiting to be thanked. She said he never talked about himself, never mentioned what he used to do before he opened the garage, and that the regulars had long since stopped asking. Evelyn listened carefully, turning the information over like a puzzle piece that didn't fit cleanly into any frame she already had. The man with grease-stained jackets and a quiet voice was beginning to look like someone with an entirely different life buried just beneath the surface of this one. Evelyn caught up with Mason just outside the cafe door, where the rain had softened into a fine mist drifting beneath the gray morning sky. She called out to him before he could reach his truck, asking simply who he was, since whatever she had just witnessed didn't match anything she did from a man who fixed cars for a living. Mason kept walking at the same unhurried pace, suggesting she forget what she saw and go back inside before her coffee went cold. Evelyn matched his stride anyway, undeterred by his lack of interest in being followed. She told him plainly that Connor Vale wasn't simply a wealthy bully looking for an easy target that morning. He was, she explained, attempting to force her company into signing a contract that would hand him access to systems far more sensitive than anyone in that cafe could imagine. She explained in clipped sentences meant to convince rather than impress that Connor had been threatening to release fabricated records that would destroy her reputation and cost her the company she had spent 15 years building, unless she agreed to his terms before the end of the week. Mason finally stopped walking, his hand resting on the door of his truck, listening despite himself. He told her he understood her trouble was real, but that it wasn't his trouble to carry. He had a daughter who needed him home for dinner, a garage that barely covered its bills, and exactly zero interest in stepping back into a world he had worked hard to leave behind. Evelyn studied his face for a long moment, recognizing the same stillness she had seen across the cafe, except now it carried the weight of something tired rather than something dangerous. She told him quietly that men like Connor never stopped at one target. If he wasn't satisfied destroying her company, he would look for someone smaller to threaten next, someone with less power to fight back, someone like a waitress with a wrist still aching from where his fingers had been. She mentioned that Connor's people had already started asking questions around the neighborhood that morning, the kind of questions that came before trouble rather than after it. Mason's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, a flicker of calculation rather than refusal. He thought of Lisa's trembling hands on that tray, of the casual cruelty in Connor's voice, of how easily that cruelty could turn toward people who had no way of defending themselves. He told Evelyn he would think about it, which was as close to agreement as she would get from him that morning. She handed him a card with only a phone number printed on it, no title, no company name, explaining that titles tended to make people nervous, and she suspected he had enough reasons already to walk away. Mason took the card without looking at it twice, slipping it into his jacket pocket beside the folder of papers he still needed to finish reading. He climbed into his truck and drove off through streets slick with rain, leaving Evelyn standing on the sidewalk wondering exactly what kind of man she had just convinced herself to trust. Mason's garage sat at the edge of an industrial block, a low brick building with a single bay door and a back office that doubled as storage for things he rarely looked at anymore. Inside, everything had its place. Tools arranged by size, a single chair positioned so it faced the entrance. An old metal box pushed beneath a workbench that hadn't been opened in longer than he liked to admit. He sat at his desk that evening. The rain finally stopped, staring at a photograph he kept tucked inside a drawer rather than displayed on any wall. It showed 6 men in desert fatigues, younger versions of faces that had changed more than time alone could explain. He closed the drawer before memory could pull him any further into it. His phone rang less than an hour later, the screen showing a name he hadn't heard called out loud in nearly 2 years. Jackson Reed's voice came through rough and familiar, asking immediately whether the footage spreading through local news channels was really Mason, really moving the way Jackson remembered him moving back when they served together. Mason admitted it was, his voice flat, already anticipating where the conversation would go next. Jackson reminded him gently that men who once operated in their old unit didn't simply disappear into ordinary lives without something eventually pulling them back, however much they hoped otherwise. Mason said he hadn't gone looking for trouble. That trouble had walked into a cafe uninvited and made the mistake of touching someone he wasn't willing to ignore. Jackson asked about Connor Vale specifically, and the question carried more weight than Mason expected. He explained that the name had come up before in circles far removed from coffee shops and broken wrist apologies, connected to a network that specialized in extorting companies through manufactured scandals, illegal surveillance, and carefully engineered media leaks. According to Jackson, this wasn't Connor's first attempt to pressure an executive into surrendering access to valuable systems, and it likely wouldn't be his last if no one stopped him this time. Mason listened without interrupting, the old discipline of gathering information before reacting settling back into him like a coat he hadn't worn in years. He had left the military after a mission that ended in failure he still carried quietly, a weight that convinced him violence should only ever be a last resort, never a habit. That failure was the reason he chose a slow, ordinary life afterward, fixing engines instead of leading operations, raising a daughter instead of commanding a unit. He had told himself for 2 years that this quieter version of himself was enough, that he no longer needed the purpose that once came with the uniform. But listening to Jackson describe what Connor was capable of, he understood that the danger circling Evelyn Carter wasn't theoretical anymore. It was the same kind of danger he used to be sent in to neutralize before it could spread any further. He thanked Jackson for the information, hung up the phone, and sat alone in the quiet garage for a long while before finally reaching for the card in his jacket pocket. By the following morning, a heavily edited clip of the Café incident had found its way onto local news broadcasts, framed entirely around 2 bodyguards being thrown off balance by a stranger who appeared to attack without provocation. The footage conveniently began the moment Mason crossed the room, cutting away the part where Connor's hand had closed around Lisa's wrist. Reporters speculated about Mason's identity, his temperament, whether he posed a danger to the neighborhood that had quietly tolerated him for years. Evelyn watched the broadcast from her office with her jaw clenched, recognizing immediately whose influence had shaped the narrative so quickly and so completely. Her board grew uneasy almost overnight, several members questioning her judgment for being present at a public altercation involving a man under such scrutiny. Connor, sensing an opening, reached out to Evelyn personally that same afternoon, offering to help quiet the story in exchange for her signature on the contract he had been pushing for weeks. He framed it as generosity, claiming he simply wanted to protect her reputation from a scandal that had nothing to do with the business deal at all. Evelyn recognized the offer for what it actually was, leverage dressed up as kindness, and told him she needed more time before deciding anything. Connor's tone shifted instantly from polite to threatening, reminding her that time was a luxury she no longer had now that her name was tied to a man being painted across every screen as dangerous. Meanwhile, Mason's garage began losing business at a pace too steady to be coincidence. 3 regular customers canceled appointments within a single day, citing vague reasons that didn't match years of loyal patronage. That night, someone threw a rock through the front window of the garage, shattering glass across the floor where Mason usually parked his tools. He swept up the mess without calling the police, recognizing the message for exactly what it was meant to be. Lisa called him the next morning, her voice tight with fear, explaining that unfamiliar cars had been parked outside her apartment for 2 nights in a row, watching rather than passing through. Mason listened to her describe the cars, the timing, the way the same man had walked past her building twice within an hour, and felt the last of his hesitation disappear entirely. He had told himself he could stay out of this, that helping Evelyn was optional. a favor rather than an obligation. But threats against an innocent waitress who had done nothing except serve coffee and ask a wealthy man to lower his voice were no longer something he could rationalize away. He called Jackson that evening and said only one sentence before hanging up. They wouldn't fight Connor with fists. They would fight him with the truth, gathered carefully enough that no lawyer or news outlet could twist it into something else. Over the following days, Mason approached the problem the way he had once approached reconnaissance missions, patiently, methodically, with no interest in being seen until seeing was unavoidable. He spent quiet hours parked a block from Connor's office building, noting which employees arrived early, which security guards rotated shifts, which black sedan returned to the same parking spot at the same time every evening. He never confronted anyone directly during this phase, choosing instead to simply watch, the same discipline that had once kept him and his unit alive in places far more dangerous than a quiet Denver street. Jackson joined him on 2 occasions, bringing equipment neither of them needed to explain to the other, old habits returning to both men with unsettling ease. Evelyn provided what she could from her side, copies of the contract Connor had been pressuring her to sign, threatening messages sent from accounts that traced back to shell companies registered overseas, and internal notes documenting every interaction her legal team had logged. Mason studied the documents at his kitchen table late one night, noticing something that made him sit back in his chair for a long moment. Connor wasn't simply trying to extract money from Evelyn's company. The contract language buried deep in its technical appendix granted access to a centralized security system her firm maintained for dozens of other corporate clients. Whoever controlled that access could theoretically monitor, manipulate, or extort every company connected to it, not just Evelyn's. He called Jackson immediately, and Jackson confirmed what Mason had begun to suspect on his own. This wasn't a personal vendetta against one executive, it was the opening move in something far larger and more dangerous. If Connor succeeded in forcing Evelyn's signature, he would gain a single point of entry into systems protecting financial records, surveillance infrastructure, and confidential data belonging to companies that had no idea they were even at risk. The scale of it settled over Mason with the particular weight of a mission briefing, the kind that demanded precision rather than improvisation. He spent the next 2 nights mapping out exactly where Connor's people met to coordinate their plans, eventually tracing the meetings to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of an industrial district that no longer appeared on any active lease. On the 3rd night, Mason approached the warehouse alone, dressed in dark clothing that blended easily into shadow, moving along the building's perimeter with the patience of someone who had done this exact kind of work more times than he could count. He avoided the single working camera mounted above the loading dock by tracking its slow rotation and timing his approach to its blind angle. He bypassed a side door lock without forcing it, slipping inside before the latch could even finish clicking shut behind him. Inside, he found exactly what he needed, a folder left carelessly on a table near a stack of unused crates, documents outlining the full scope of Connor's plan and the names of 2 other men financing the operation from a distance. He photographed everything quickly, replaced the folder exactly as he found it, and disappeared back into the night without leaving a single trace of having been there at all. When Mason shared what he had found, Evelyn expected to see satisfaction in his expression, the quiet pride of someone who had just outmaneuvered a dangerous opponent. Instead, she saw something closer to exhaustion, a tiredness that had nothing to do with the late hour or the danger involved. She asked him directly why he had tolerated Connor's insults for so long inside that cafe before finally stepping in, since clearly he could have ended things the moment Connor walked through the door. Mason considered the question carefully before answering, the way he seemed to consider most things rather than reacting on instinct. He told her that not every insult deserved a response, that anger spent on careless words was anger wasted on something that couldn't actually hurt anyone. It was only when someone vulnerable was touched, threatened, or endangered that the calculation changed entirely for him. Evelyn sat with that answer longer than she expected to, turning it over against everything she had built her own life around. For years, she had measured strength in terms of leverage, capital, board votes, and the particular kind of power that came from controlling outcomes before anyone else even realized there was a decision to be made. Mason's version of strength looked nothing like that. His strength lived in restraint, in choosing exactly when force was necessary and refusing to let it spill into moments that didn't require it. She admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that she had spent her career assuming power needed to be loud to be effective. Watching him operate quietly through every difficult moment of the past several days had begun to convince her otherwise. There was a brief stillness between them that evening, neither romantic nor entirely professional, something closer to two people recognizing a kind of honesty in each other that didn't often survive long in either of their separate worlds. Mason kept a careful distance even then, mindful of the life he had built around stability rather than complication. He told her plainly that whatever happened with Connor, he intended to go back to fixing cars and raising his daughter once it was finished, nothing more dramatic than that. Evelyn nodded, understanding the boundary without needing it explained any further than that. She appreciated more than she expected to a man who wanted nothing from her except to see the right outcome reached cleanly. Connor scheduled a private signing 2 days later on the top floor of a downtown hotel, confident that public opinion had turned firmly against Mason and that Evelyn had no leverage left to refuse him. He chose the location deliberately. A quiet executive suite far from witnesses, accessible only through a single elevator bank his own security team controlled for the evening. Evelyn agreed to attend, but only after consulting a lawyer who helped her prepare a recording device legal under state law, small enough to remain hidden beneath the lapel of her jacket. Lisa agreed separately to provide a written statement about the Café incident, ready to be released the moment it was needed, rather than buried under whatever story Connor's people had constructed. Mason and Jackson spent the prior evening walking through every possible version of how the meeting might unfold, refusing to leave anything to chance that careful preparation could prevent. Inside the suite, Connor greeted Evelyn with the practiced charm of someone certain he had already won, gesturing toward a stack of papers waiting on the table beside 2 pens lined up with theatrical precision. He spoke openly once the door closed behind them, more confident than careful, admitting in casual tones that the footage from the café had been edited specifically to protect his own image rather than reflect what actually happened. He went further than Evelyn expected, mentioning the men watching Lisa's apartment and the access he intended to gain through the very contract sitting between them. Evelyn kept her expression steady, letting him talk, every word landing exactly where her recording device needed it to land. What neither of them anticipated was a small scanner near the door designed to detect exactly this kind of device, installed earlier that day by one of Connor's own security consultants as a precaution against exactly this scenario. The moment it triggered, Connor's expression hardened, and he ordered the floor sealed before Evelyn could reach the elevator. 2 men positioned themselves at the only visible exit, blocking her path while Connor demanded the device be handed over immediately. Evelyn's pulse spiked, though she kept her voice level, stalling for time she wasn't certain she actually had. She had not anticipated needing rescue quite this quickly, but somewhere beneath the floor, a man who specialized in exactly this kind of situation was already moving. Mason had anticipated a sealed floor as one of several likely outcomes and had positioned himself near a service stairwell 2 levels below rather than waiting in the lobby with everyone else. He disabled the auxiliary lock controlling the service corridor within minutes, bypassing the floor's security system through a maintenance panel few people outside building staff ever noticed existed. By the time Connor's men realized the main exits were secured, Mason was already moving through the hotel's service passages, quiet and unseen, closing the distance between himself and the room where Evelyn now stood facing 2 armed men and a man who finally believed he had nothing left to lose. Mason entered the executive suite not through the front door Connor's men were watching, but through a side panel near the kitchenette that hotel staff used for room service deliveries no one ever questioned. He killed the corridor lighting along one section of hallway before he arrived, just enough to disrupt the easy visibility Connor's men depended on, never enough to draw obvious attention to the change. His goal wasn't violence for its own sake. It was separating Connor's men from each other long enough to remove their advantage of numbers. He used the reflection in a darkened window to track movement inside the suite before he ever stepped through the doorway himself, the same technique that had kept him alive through missions far more dangerous than a hotel hallway. The first guard noticed him only after it was already too late to react, Mason closing the distance silently and redirecting the man's weight against a side table hard enough to disable without seriously injuring him. The second guard spun toward the sound, swinging wide into empty air as Mason shifted half a step out of reach, using the narrow hallway exactly the way he had used the cafe's tight spacing days earlier. Evelyn, watching from across the room, felt something settle in her chest despite the chaos unfolding in front of her, recognizing immediately that nothing about what she was witnessing came from instinct or luck. Every motion carried purpose, every choice calculated half a second before it was needed. Connor, panicking now that his plan had unraveled faster than he expected, grabbed Evelyn's arm and pulled her toward him, using her as a shield against whatever was coming through the doorway. Mason stepped into the room fully then, his eyes locking onto Connor's hand exactly where it gripped Evelyn's wrist, the same grip he had broken once before in a cafe that suddenly felt very far away. He didn't rush forward recklessly. He approached with the same measured calm that had unsettled Connor from the very beginning, each step closing distance without giving Connor any clear opening to react before it was already too late to matter. Within seconds, Mason had Connor's arm locked at an angle that made resistance pointless without causing lasting damage, forcing him to release Evelyn cleanly and without further struggle. Connor cried out more from humiliation than pain, his earlier confidence collapsing entirely now that the room had turned so completely against him. Evelyn stepped back, breathing hard but unharmed, her recording device still capturing every word despite the scanner that had detected its presence earlier. Moments later, the stairwell door burst open as Jackson arrived with 2 officers and an attorney who had been waiting nearby for exactly this signal, all of them entering just in time to witness Connor's earlier confession, still echoing through a backup recording Evelyn had quietly synced to a secondary device the scanner never found. The officers moved quickly once they understood what they were looking at, securing both incapacitated bodyguards and placing Connor under arrest before he could fully process how thoroughly his own words had condemned him. Mason stepped back from the center of the room the moment law enforcement took over, returning instinctively to the same quiet stillness that had defined him since the very first morning in that cafe. Evelyn caught his eye across the room, gratitude written plainly across her face, though neither of them said anything just yet. There would be time for words later. For now, it was enough that the danger had ended cleanly, with evidence intact and no one seriously hurt, exactly the outcome Mason had been working towards since the moment he decided to step back into a world he thought he had left behind for good. Within days, the full footage from the cafe finally reached the public eye, unedited and complete, showing clearly what the earlier broadcast had deliberately cut away. Viewers saw Connor grab Lisa's wrist, heard the cruelty in his voice toward Mason, and watched the entire sequence unfold exactly as it had happened, rather than the carefully arranged version Connor's people had circulated. Public opinion reversed almost overnight. Reporters who had once called Mason dangerous now scrambling to learn anything they could about the quiet mechanic at the center of the story. Mason declined every interview request that came his way, asking only that Lisa's privacy and the cafe staff's safety be respected above anything else. Evelyn held a press conference the following week, choosing to take responsibility publicly for hesitating before standing up to Connor when she had first seen warning signs months earlier. She thanked Mason by name, briefly, respectfully, careful not to push him further into a spotlight she knew he never wanted in the first place. Connor faced multiple charges in the following weeks, including extortion, unlawful surveillance, falsifying evidence, and conspiracy to access protected corporate systems without authorization. The 2 men financing his operation from a distance were identified shortly afterward through the documents Mason had photographed inside the warehouse, both facing their own separate legal consequences. Mason's garage saw a quiet but steady return of customers in the weeks that followed, some new, most familiar faces who had simply needed time to understand what they had actually witnessed that rainy morning. He fixed the broken window himself, refusing an offer from a local business association to cover the cost, preferring instead to handle it the same way he handled most things, quietly and without fuss. He never once described what had happened as a victory, not to Jackson, not to Lisa, and certainly not to himself. To him, it had simply been the closing of a door that should never have been opened toward people who didn't deserve the trouble it brought into their lives. Several weeks later, Mason walked back into the same cafe on another quiet morning, though this time the rain had finally given way to a thin, clean sunlight breaking through the clouds outside. No one laughed when he walked in. No one looked away either. Lisa brought his coffee without needing to ask how he wanted it, setting it down with a small, genuine smile that carried none of the nervous energy from the morning everything had changed. The other regulars nodded toward him quietly as he passed, a kind of respect that asked for nothing in return, simply acknowledging what they now understood about the man who had spent years sitting quietly in the corner. Evelyn arrived not long after, choosing the same corner table rather than her usual spot near the window, sliding into the seat across from him without ceremony. She told him she hadn't come as a chief executive needing rescue this time, only as someone who wanted to properly thank the man who had risked everything for people who had nothing to offer him in return. Mason accepted the thanks simply, without deflecting it the way he might have a month earlier. She mentioned carefully that her company could use someone with his particular skills as a security consultant, though she made it clear she wasn't asking him to decide anything that morning. Mason told her he would think about it, the same answer he had given her once before outside this very cafe in the rain. He explained that whatever decision he made would depend entirely on whether it cost him the quiet life he had spent 2 years rebuilding for his daughter's sake. Evelyn understood completely, setting a small card on the table between them, the same kind of simple card without titles she had given him once already, and didn't push the conversation any further than that. She smiled, finished her coffee, and let the silence between them settle into something comfortable rather than expectant. When Mason finally stood to leave, the sunlight outside had grown brighter, drying the last of the rain from the sidewalk in patches of pale gold. He was no longer the man Connor had mocked weeks earlier, though he had never needed to prove that to anyone in the first place. He didn't walk out as a legend, didn't carry himself like someone who expected applause for choosing decency over silence. He simply walked out as a man who had chosen, at exactly the right moment, to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, and who understood that some kinds of strength were never meant to be loud at all. If you believe the strongest man is often the quietest one, stay close for what comes next.